My family story is one of betrayal and heartbreak that changed the course of many lives. 20 years ago, my older brother Andrew, our parents' golden child, had an affair with our middle brother David's girlfriend. The betrayal led to David's suicide attempt and hospitalization. Yet somehow, our parents blamed David and supported Andrew and the girlfriend. I cut ties with them all and built a new life. Now, 20 years later, my niece has found me claiming she's David's biological daughter, not Andrew's. She says Andrew has resented her since birth. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you've ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life completely. Growing up in the small town of Riverdale, our family dynamics were established early and remained unshakable throughout my childhood and teenage years. I was Burton, the youngest of three brothers, often overlooked but observant, watching the dramatic differences in how my parents treated my siblings. Andrew, the oldest at 28, had always been the golden child, handsome, charismatic, and seemingly perfect in our parents' eyes. He excelled in sports, maintained excellent grades, and secured a promising position at our father's law firm immediately after college. No achievement of his was too small for celebration. No request too large to be fulfilled. When he wanted a new car for his 16th birthday, our parents bought him a brand new sports car. When he decided law school was his path, they paid every expense without question. David, the middle child at 26, existed in a different reality altogether. Sensitive, artistic, and introverted, he struggled to live up to the impossible standard Andrew had set. His interest in photography and literature was dismissed as impractical by our father. His achievements, no matter how significant, were always compared unfavorably to Andrew's. When David won a prestigious photography competition in high school, our parents attended the ceremony, but spent most of the evening talking about Andrew's recent internship. When David needed help with college tuition, he was told to take out loans and learn responsibility. I was 24, the youngest, neither the star nor the disappointment, just the afterthought. I learned early to keep my head down, meet expectations without drawing attention, and observe the toxic patterns that defined our family. I developed a particularly close relationship with David, united in our shared experience of living in Andrew's shadow. The dynamics might have remained unchanged if not for Jessica. She entered our lives during a family barbecue 5 years ago, arriving as David's girlfriend of 6 months. Jessica was studying nursing, working part-time at the local hospital, and had the kind of warm, genuine personality that immediately endeared her to everyone. Everyone except Andrew, who watched her with an intensity that made me uncomfortable from the moment they were introduced. David was visibly transformed by his relationship with Jessica. For the first time, he seemed confident, hopeful about the future, and genuinely happy. He confided in me that he was planning to propose to her after her graduation, showing me the vintage engagement ring he had saved for months to purchase. I had never seen my brother so full of life and purpose. She actually sees me, Burton, he told me one evening as we sat on my apartment balcony. Not as a disappointment or a shadow of Andrew, but just as me. Do you know how rare that is? I did know. In our family, being seen for who you truly were was the rarest gift of all. The warning signs began subtly. Andrew suddenly appearing at the cafe where Jessica studied. Andrew offering to help her prepare for a difficult exam because he happened to know the subject well. Andrew mentioning Jessica in conversations with increasing frequency. I noticed, but dismissed my concerns. Surely even Andrew wouldn't cross that line. The truth emerged on what should have been one of the happiest nights of David's life. He had just received news that one of his photography series would be featured in a prestigious gallery, showing a professional breakthrough he had worked toward for years. He planned a special dinner with Jessica to celebrate and share his proposal plans. When Jessica didn't show up for dinner and wouldn't answer her phone, David became concerned. He drove to her apartment, used the key she had given him, and found her in bed with Andrew. What happened next pieced together from multiple accounts. David's devastated phone call to me that night. Jessica's tearful explanation days later. And the sanitized version our parents eventually adopted as truth. David had collapsed in shock, then erupted in rage, unlike anything anyone had seen from him before. Words were exchanged ugly and unforgivable. Andrew, always, the physically stronger one, had easily overpowered David when the confrontation turned physical, leaving my middle brother bloodied and even more humiliated. David drove home in a state of blind grief, swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills, and texted me a brief message. "I cannot do this anymore. I am sorry. It is not your fault." I found him unconscious in his apartment, called an ambulance, and rode with him to the hospital, praying the entire time that I wasn't too late. The doctors pumped his stomach and saved his life, but something fundamental had broken in David that would never fully heal. What happened in the aftermath still burns in my memory as the ultimate betrayal. Not just Andrew's actions, but how our entire family system responded to the crisis. Our parents rushed to the hospital, but their concern quickly shifted from David's condition to damage control. My father took Andrew aside, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about getting stories straight and protecting reputations. My mother sat by David's bed, not with compassion, but with disappointment etched across her face, asking him how he could do this to the family and create such a scene. When David was stable enough to be moved to the psychiatric ward for mandatory observation, our parents visited once, briefly bringing clothes and toiletries, but little emotional support. Meanwhile, they rallied around Andrew, who crafted a narrative in which he and Jessica had fought their feelings, but ultimately couldn't deny their connection. In this version, David had overreacted, had always been unstable, and Andrew and Jessica were the victims of his inability to handle rejection. Most shockingly, Jessica moved into the family home within weeks of David's hospitalization, welcomed by our parents, as if she had always been meant to be with Andrew rather than David. There was no acknowledgement of betrayal, no consequences for either of them. I tried to advocate for David, confronting Andrew in a rage-filled argument that ended with my father stepping between us and warning me to get on board with reality. When I brought up the engagement ring, David had shown me my mother dismissed it as fantasy and suggested David had imagined a deeper relationship than actually existed. The gaslighting was complete when my parents began referring to David's suicide attempt as a cry for attention and suggesting he had always been dramatic. They referenced incidents from his childhood, rewriting our family history to paint David as perpetually troubled and Andrew as perpetually patient with him. I spent as much time as possible at the hospital with David, watching him retreat further into himself with each passing day. When he was finally released, he refused to return to the family home, instead staying in my small apartment while he recovered physically. The emotional wounds I feared might never heal. The final breaking point came 3 months after the initial incident. Our parents invited the family for Sunday dinner, a long-standing tradition that had been on hold during the crisis. David declined to attend. I went only to act as a buffer between him and the rest of the family, to gather information about what he might face when he eventually had to interact with them again. What I witnessed that evening severed my connection to my parents and Andrew permanently. Jessica sat at the table wearing an engagement ring. Not the vintage piece David had saved for, but a flashy diamond, clearly chosen to outshine what he had planned to give her. Andrew announced they were expecting a child conceived around the time of the betrayal. My parents beamed with pride, talking about their first grandchild and how things have a way of working out as they should. When my mother suggested we should encourage David to join us for these family celebrations because he needs to move forward, something in me snapped. I stood up, looked at each of their faces, and spoke the words that would define the next 20 years of my life. You have chosen who matters in this family, and it is not David. It is not me. I want no part of this twisted version of support and love. Do not contact me again. I walked out of that house and directly to my apartment, where I told David everything. Together we made plans. I had job opportunities in Seattle across the country from our New England hometown. David needed a complete break from the environment that had nearly killed him. Within a month, we had both relocated, sharing an apartment, while we established new lives far from the toxic atmosphere of our family. The pregnancy announcement had devastated David all over again. Not just the betrayal, but the possibility that the child might have been conceived while he and Jessica were still together. The timeline was suspicious, the convenient narrative too perfect. But David, always the one with the bigger heart, worried about the child who would be born into such a situation. That baby deserves better than them, he said quietly as we packed our belongings. Better than all of this. I couldn't have imagined then how prophetic his words would prove to be. The first 5 years after cutting contact were the hardest. My parents made periodic attempts to reach out, always framing their messages around healing the family and moving past differences, without any acknowledgement of the fundamental wrongs that had occurred. Andrew never contacted either of us, directly sending holiday cards with photos of his expanding family instead. First the daughter Lily, then twin boys 2 years later. David and I built new lives in Seattle. I secured a position with a technology firm that valued my skills and provided stability. David slowly reconnected with his passion for photography, eventually establishing a modest reputation in the local art scene. We maintained our shared apartment for 3 years before deciding we had both healed enough to live independently. David never fully recovered from the betrayal and suicide attempt. He struggled with depression, underwent extensive therapy, and gradually built a quiet life focused on his art and a small circle of trusted friends. He dated occasionally, but never committed to another serious relationship. The scars were too deep, the fear of vulnerability too great. Some wounds change who you are permanently, he told me during a rare conversation about the past. I am not the person I would have been if things had happened differently, but I am still here, still creating, still finding beauty in the world. That has to be enough. For 10 years, we maintained absolute no contact with our family of origin. I heard through distant connections that Andrew and Jessica had welcomed their third child, that my father had retired from his law practice and handed control to Andrew, that family life continued in Riverdale, as if the missing branches of the family tree had never existed. Then, without warning, David was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. The prognosis was poor from the beginning, but he fought with characteristic quiet determination, undergoing brutal rounds of chemotherapy that left him exhausted and vulnerable. I took a leave of absence from work to support him moving back into his apartment temporarily to help manage his care. During one of his more lucid periods between treatments, David made me promise something that seemed strange at the time. If anything happens to me, I want you to keep an eye on Lily, he said, referring to Andrew and Jessica's oldest child, his niece, whom he had never met. Why Lily specifically, I asked, assuming it was the medication affecting his thinking. David hesitated, then shook his head. Just a feeling. Promise me. I promised, attributing the request to the natural concern an uncle might feel for a niece, even one he had never known. I didn't press further, focusing, instead, on his immediate needs and comfort. David passed away 15 months after his diagnosis, peacefully with me holding his hand. I handled the arrangements alone, honoring his wishes for a simple cremation and a small gathering of friends rather than a formal funeral. I notified our parents and Andrew of his death with brief, factual emails, not expecting or wanting their involvement. To my surprise, they all attended the memorial service, arriving together and sitting at the back of the room. They made no attempt to speak during the service, but afterward my mother approached me with tears streaming down her face. "We should have been there for him," she said, her voice breaking. "For both of you." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of wrongdoing I had ever heard from her, but it came too late to matter. I nodded politely and turned away, unable and unwilling to engage with the complicated grief they now claimed to feel. Andrew approached next, looking older and more worn than his 38 years should have warranted. "Burton, I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but I need to tell you something about David." "Now is not the time," I replied coldly. "It is exactly the time," he insisted, lowering his voice. "David visited Riverdale 5 years ago. He came to see Lily. Did he ever tell you that?" The information stunned me. "That is impossible. He would have told me. He made me promise not to tell anyone, including Jessica and our parents. He said he just needed to see her once in person. I met him at a diner outside town. He looked at photos, asked questions about her. Then he left. I never understood why it mattered so much to him. I searched Andrew's face for signs of deception, but found only genuine confusion and what appeared to be genuine grief. Before I could respond, Jessica approached with a teenage girl who could only be Lily, now about 15 years old. The resemblance hit me like a physical blow. Lily had David's eyes, not just the color, but the shape, the expressive quality that had always made his emotions so transparent. She had his slight build, his way of standing with weight shifted to one side. Details I might have dismissed individually formed an undeniable pattern when viewed together. I excused myself abruptly, unable to process the implications in that moment of raw grief. The possibility was too enormous, too world-altering to consider while standing over the memorial display of my brother's photography. Life continued in the wake of David's death. I returned to work, maintained the small connections that defined my life, and tried to honor David's memory by supporting the arts organizations that had meant so much to him. I did not reach out to my family again, assuming our brief reconnection at the memorial service would be our last interaction. 5 years passed. I had built a successful career, purchased a home, even begun a promising relationship with Claire, a professor at the local university. David's death had left an unfillable void, but I had constructed a life that honored his memory while still moving forward. Then came the email that would upend everything once again. The message appeared in my inbox on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the subject line simply "Uncle Burton" from Lily. The content was brief, but earth-shattering. "My name is Lily Montgomery. You're my uncle, though. We've only met once at my Uncle David's memorial service. I have reason to believe that David was actually my biological father, not Andrew. I need to talk to you. Please contact me, if you're willing. I'm 20 now, and living on my own, attending college. My parents don't know I'm reaching out." Attached was a recent photo of Lily, and the resemblance to David was even more striking in adulthood. The same thoughtful expression, the same artistic sensitivity evident in her eyes. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with my phone number and a simple, "I'm here when you're ready to talk." The call came that evening. Lily's voice was steady but tinged with the nervousness of someone stepping into unknown territory. "Thank you for responding," she began. "I wasn't sure you would." "Honestly, I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "This is unexpected." "For me too," she said with a slight laugh that reminded me painfully of David. "I've been putting pieces together for years, but I only recently found enough evidence to be certain." "What evidence?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Medical records, mostly. I needed my full genetic history for a college medical form, and when I accessed my birth records, there were inconsistencies. The blood types don't match for Andrew to be my biological father. It's scientifically impossible." Her methodical approach was impressively thorough. She continued. "Then I found old letters in my mother's keepsake box. Letters from David to her from before I was born. They were intimate. It was clear they had a relationship that overlapped with when she started dating Andrew." "You confronted your mother?" I asked, surprised at her courage. "No," Lily replied. "She doesn't know I found them. But after reading them, I started noticing how differently I've always been treated compared to my brothers. Andrew has never connected with me the way he does with them. There's always been this distance, this resentment that I could feel, but never understand. The pieces were aligning with terrible clarity. David's suicide attempt after finding Jessica with Andrew. Jessica's pregnancy announcement 3 months later. The timeline had always been suspicious. "There's more," Lily continued. "A few years ago, I got really sick with a kidney infection. The doctor mentioned certain genetic factors that increase susceptibility. Later, I found out that David had the same condition as a teenager. Andrew has no history of it." "Did you ever meet David?" I asked, remembering Andrew's claim about a secret meeting. Once she confirmed, her voice softening. "When I was 15, he reached out through my school, asked to meet at a coffee shop near campus. My parents never knew. He just said he was my uncle and wanted to know me. We talked about photography. I was taking classes then. He seemed so sad." David's strange request suddenly made perfect sense. Keep an eye on Lily. He had known, or at least strongly suspected. "Why are you contacting me now?" I asked. "Because I'm trying to understand who I am," she replied simply. "My whole life has been built on a lie. My relationship with the man I thought was my father has always been strained, and now I know why." I wanted to connect with someone who knew David, who could tell me about him beyond just the basic facts. "What do you know about why David and I left Riverdale?" I asked carefully. "Almost nothing," she admitted. "My parents never talk about it. When I asked after meeting you at the memorial service, they said there was a falling out over business matters." Business matters. The sanitized, bloodless version of a betrayal that had nearly cost David his life and had ultimately cost him his daughter. "Lily, there's a lot to unpack here," I said finally. "If you want the truth, I can give it to you, but it's not pleasant. It will change how you see your parents. Are you sure you're ready for that?" There was a long pause before she answered. "I've been living with half-truths my entire life. I'd rather have the whole truth, even if it hurts." I spent the next hour telling her everything. The golden child dynamic, the affair David's suicide attempt, our parents' response and our subsequent exile. I didn't embellish or minimize, simply presented the facts as I had experienced them. When I finished, Lily was silent for so long, I thought we might have lost the connection. "Lily," I finally prompted. "I'm still here," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It explains so much. The way Andrew looks at me sometimes like I'm a living reminder of something he wants to forget. The way my grandparents always seem to be compensating for something with their attention. The comments about how different I am from the rest of the family. What will you do with this information?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I'd like to know more about David, about my real father. Would you be willing to tell me about him? What he was like? What he loved? How he saw the world?" "I would like nothing more," I said, feeling a weight lift from my chest, the weight of carrying David's memory alone for so long. We agreed to meet in person the following month when she had a break from classes. After ending the call, I sat in my living room, staring at David's photographs that hung on my walls, seeing in them now not just my brother's vision, but the artistic sensibility that had apparently passed to his daughter. Jessica's betrayal had been even more complete than any of us had realized. She had not only cheated on David with his brother, but had allowed her daughter to be raised by a man who resented her very existence, denied her the chance to know her biological father, and perpetuated a lie that had warped Lily's entire childhood. I wondered what would happen when Lily eventually confronted her parents with the truth, whether Andrew had known all along or had simply suspected as David apparently had. Whether my parents were also complicit in the deception. The thought of the family reckoning that awaited them filled me with complicated emotions, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that long-delayed consequences were finally catching up. Lily and I met for the first time as true family at a quiet cafe in Portland, halfway between Seattle and her college campus. She arrived early nervously, fidgeting with her camera, a detail that made my heart ache with recognition. David had always done the same when anxious, unconsciously adjusting settings as a way to keep his hands busy. Our conversation flowed more easily than I expected, perhaps, because we shared not just genes but the experience of navigating a family built on appearances rather than authentic connection. I brought photos of David's stories from our childhood and examples of his work that had never been publicly displayed. Lily absorbed everything with intense focus, occasionally making observations about her own interests and personality that echoed David so precisely it was startling. "I always felt like an outsider in my family," she confessed over coffee. "Not just because of how Andrew treated me, but because I never understood their priorities. The emphasis on status and appearances always seemed hollow to me." David felt the same way, I told her. He used to say our family was like a beautiful house with no foundation, impressive from the outside, but fundamentally unstable. Lily nodded understanding immediately. "That's exactly it. Everything looks perfect in the family photos, but behind closed doors there's this constant tension, this feeling that everyone's playing a role rather than actually connecting." We parted with plans to meet again, Lily, taking with her copies of David's photographs and journals that I had preserved. I felt a profound sense of rightness in passing these treasures, to his daughter the continuation of his legacy that he had never known existed. 2 weeks later, Lily called me in a state of agitation. "I confronted them," she said without preamble. "All of them. My parents, my grandparents. I told them I know the truth about David being my biological father." What happened? I asked, suddenly concerned for her well-being. Chaos, she replied, with a bitter laugh. At first they tried to deny it, but I had the medical records, the blood type incompatibility. Mom finally broke down and admitted everything, that she had been seeing both of them at the same time, that she wasn't sure who the father was when she got pregnant, that they all just assumed it was Andrew's because it was cleaner that way. And Andrew, he knew, she said, her voice hardening. He always suspected, which explains why he could never fully accept me as his daughter. But instead of being honest, instead of giving me the chance to know my real father, they all agreed to this massive lie. 20 years of pretending, of making me feel like there was something wrong with me for not fitting in. What about my parents? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Grandmother started crying, saying they thought it was for the best and that they never meant to hurt anyone. Grandfather just sat there looking shocked that anyone would dare bring this up after all this time. It was like they thought the secret would just stay buried forever. What will you do now? I asked, worried about the precarious position she now found herself in. I'm staying with my roommate for now, she said. I can't be in that house looking at them every day knowing what they did. Not just to me, but to David. They let me believe a lie my entire life, and they drove my real father away when he needed them most. Over the following months, Lily began the process of reclaiming her identity. She legally changed her last name to David's, our mother's maiden name, that David had adopted after cutting ties with the family. She immersed herself in learning about him through his work, his journals, and the stories I shared. She even began exploring photography more seriously, finding in it a connection to the father she had barely known. The family she had grown up with reacted predictably. Andrew oscillated between anger and attempts at reconciliation, never quite acknowledging the fundamental wrong that had been done. Jessica pleaded for understanding, casting herself as young and confused at the time of the betrayal, minimizing the 2 decades of deception that followed. My parents attempted to mediate, still trying to preserve the appearance of family unity without addressing the rot at its core. Lily maintained contact with her younger brothers, who were innocent in the deception but established firm boundaries with the adults who had conspired to deny her the truth of her own origins. She began spending holidays with me and Claire, forming a new family connection based on honesty rather than obligation. The most unexpected development came 6 months after Lily's confrontation with the family. Andrew appeared at my door, unannounced, looking haggard and defeated. Jessica has left me, he said, without preamble, when I reluctantly invited him in. She said she cannot keep living the lie. That watching Lily walk away made her realize what we had done. I offered no sympathy, waiting silently for him to continue. The boys are confused. My parents are devastated. Everything is falling apart. He looked up at me with desperate eyes. How do I fix this, Burton? How do I make it right? The question was so fundamentally flawed that I almost laughed. 20 years of consequences finally catching up, and still, he was looking for a quick solution, a way to restore the comfortable facade without doing the difficult work of genuine atonement. You do not fix 2 decades of lies and betrayal, I told him. You acknowledge what you did. You accept the consequences, and you commit to being honest going forward, even when that honesty makes you look bad. You stop trying to control the narrative and start listening to the people you have hurt. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said, a familiar refrain from our childhood. Andrew's way of distancing himself from the consequences of his actions. But it did happen, I replied. You slept with David's girlfriend. You watched him spiral into despair. You built a life on his pain. You raised his daughter while resenting her for not being fully yours. These are not things that happened. They are choices you made repeatedly for years. Andrew had no response, just sat in miserable silence. Lily is the priority now, I continued. Not your comfort, not the family image, not what the neighbors might think. If you want any relationship with her going forward, you need to respect that she is processing 20 years of lies, and that takes time. You need to accept that she may never forgive you, and that would be her right. He left shortly after, no closer to understanding the depth of the damage he had helped create, but perhaps beginning to recognize that this time there would be no easy restoration of the status quo. In the years since that conversation, Our family has remained fractured, but with new connections forming in unexpected ways. Lily has found her place in my life as David's daughter and my niece. She visits regularly, has developed a warm relationship with Claire, and has begun establishing herself as a photographer with a distinctive style that echoes her father's while remaining uniquely her own. Jessica moved across the country, maintaining limited contact with Lily, while giving her the space to process the betrayal. Andrew remains in the family home with their sons, attempting to rebuild his life without the golden child status that had defined him for so long. My parents have made halting attempts to connect with Lily and me, struggling to understand a family dynamic they can no longer control. The truth once revealed could not be contained. It rippled through every relationship, exposing the fault lines that had always existed beneath the perfect family facade. Some connections broke permanently, others transformed into something new and more authentic. David would have been proud of his daughter. Her courage in seeking truth, her resilience in facing it, her determination to build a life based on who she really is, rather than who others expect her to be. In her, I see echoes of the brother I lost twice, first to betrayal and family dysfunction, and later to illness. Through Lily, some essential part of David lives on, not just in her features or mannerisms, but in her spirit, her artistic eye, her fundamental decency. The golden child's choices ultimately destroyed the very family system that had elevated him. The truth buried for 20 years found its way to the surface. And David, who never knew he had a daughter, has found justice of a sort in her determination to claim her true identity and forge connections based on honesty rather than convenience. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew about your origins? How did you handle the revelation? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this video resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, identity, and finding truth. Share with someone who might be struggling with toxic family relationships and needs to know they're not alone. Thank you for listening to this complicated family saga, and remember, sometimes the family we create through honesty and genuine connection is more valuable than the one we're born into.